I certainly don't need a special occasion for a sweet treat, but with Valentine's Day just around the corner, these sweet treats that I'm showing you in this video are just perfect. And also, I'm going to show you that sourdough is not just for bread. You can also add that to your sweet recipes and actually elevate the flavors. What I love about these recipes is that they're super uncomplicated. All you need is one bowl, and they're very straightforward and really easy to make. The first recipe I'm making is sourdough chocolate chip cookies. Such a classic, and I'm starting with melted butter, to which I'm adding my sugars, and I'm using a combination of white sugar and brown sugar, which is really the classic recipe. And I basically used the classic recipe as a jumping point for developing my own recipe here. And the brown sugar adds that color and the deeper taste. So I'm adding that to the butter. And now I'm just going to mix up the two. You can either use an electric mixer, you could use the stand mixer if you have one like my KitchenAid in the back, but this is a smaller recipe and I thought it would be easier to do it by hand. To that I'm adding the egg. This is half a batch of the recipe because it's just plenty. And again, I'm mixing it up really well to get it all fluffy and foamy and one uniform consistency, which is pretty much like the regular non-sourdough recipe. Next, I'm adding my homemade vanilla extract. I always like to eyeball it a little bit. And here's my sourdough starter, which has nicely risen. And this is the secret ingredient that makes this so yummy and even better than the original version, in my opinion. And also it adds a little bit of health benefit if you ferment the cookies for a longer time in the refrigerator for 8 hours or overnight. And these are all the wet ingredients that I'm adding to my bowl here, and I would like to use a big bowl because then I only need one bowl. And sometimes I don't know if lazy is the right word, but I like to be efficient in my kitchen, and if I can mix everything in one bowl, why not? Because it cuts down on the cleanup. Now I'm adding my dry ingredients, the flour. You can use any flour you have. I'm using spelt flour because that is currently what I have in my flour container, and baking powder, baking soda, just to give these cookies a little bit of a lift and a little bit of an airier consistency, and salt brings out the sweetness of the sugars. And the goal here is to incorporate the dry ingredients without over mixing, because otherwise the dough and the cookies will get a little bit more chewy and doughy. So you just want to incorporate them. And for this, the wire whisk wasn't really the best tool to use because the dough got stuck on the inside of the whisk. Chocolate chips, if you love chocolate chips, you might go a little bit heavier than I did, but you just want to fold them in and not overmix the dough again. And once this is all done, you kind of want to flatten it in the bottom of the bowl and refrigerate the dough for at least 2 hours. You can also stick them in the freezer. And when you're ready to bake them, make sure you preheat your oven. And I like to use an ice cream scoop for my cookie scoop. You can use a regular cookie scoop. And I like to butter it a little bit because that makes the cookie dough stick to it less and makes it easier to come out. And there's always some extra butter that I have that I can use to grease the cookie scoop or the ice cream scoop. This also helps with making the cookies an even size, and I'm dropping them on a parchment lined baking tray. You want to space them about 2 inches apart, but if you're not worried about the edges coming close and you're not having to break the cookies apart, it doesn't really matter. What I love though is that they are just really nicely dome shaped, and that also helps with retaining some of their shape instead of them getting super flat during the baking process. And also I just love that they're all pretty much even sized. Sometimes I like to press the cookie dough a little bit into the ice cream scoop. Now I bake them, and every oven is different. Every oven heats a little bit differently, so you want to start with maybe 15 minutes and then maybe add a little bit more time as you go. The remaining dough, because we've been testing cookies so much that we have more cookies than we needed, but I really wanted to nail the recipe. Now I am freezing the rest of the batch, and this is super easy and convenient. I simply scoop out the cookie dough on another cookie tray or anything that will actually fit in your freezer, but you want to keep the dough balls slightly apart. Now let's take out the cookies here. They are perfectly done, and you can either let them sit on the cookie sheet for a few minutes before you transfer them to a wire rack, or you can also transfer them immediately so they don't cook any further. That really depends on how you brown your edges you like them, or how chewy you want them, or how soft you want them on the inside. Here is the frozen cookie dough balls, and I really need to make sure that I label my Ziploc bags, because in the moment when I think I will remember what it is, then I don't think it's necessary to label and to put a date on it. But more often than not, I look at some things in my freezer later and I cannot figure out what it is, and that's just a shame. And so note to self, always label the Ziploc bag, and then these cookies will last in your freezer for up to 6 months. And whenever you need a cookie, you can even just bake 1 cookie or 2 cookies, depending on how many you need, and you don't need to make a new batch of cookies all the time and then have more than you can eat, which is super convenient, and that is what I love about this recipe. And here are the perfectly baked cookies. I hope you will give them a try. Now the other recipe here is a sourdough brownie recipe, which I've been wanting to do for a long time. Another 1 bowl recipe, which is absolutely what I love. I have played with adding the wet ingredients before the dry ingredients, and this time I'm using the dry ingredients and adding them to the bowl before the wet ingredients. It really doesn't matter so much. It kind of depends on your personal preference. Sometimes it's easier to start with the wet ingredients, is what I have found though. Cocoa powder, you can either use Dutch processed or regular one. It doesn't matter. It comes out delicious either way. And that adds to the dark chocolate flavor of the brownies. A little bit salt, again, always brings out the sweetness and all the flavors. So just again, I'm mixing the dry ingredients. I'm also linking the recipe card in the description box, and in the recipe card, I'm starting it with the wet ingredients and then adding the dry ingredients. I'm adding the melted butter, and one thing I didn't do in this round of brownie testing was melting the chocolate chips. It actually makes the brownies a little bit more fudgy. Again, that is in the recipe card that I'm linking. If you want them a little bit more cakey and crumbly, you can do it as I do it and add the chocolate chips later instead of melting them into the dough. And here's my sourdough starter that always makes this such an elevated recipe to add that to the dough. Here you can see all the ingredients. I simply mix it up, and the same here as for the sourdough chocolate chip cookies. You don't want to overmix, you just want to fold in. And if you have little specks of flour, don't worry about it. That will actually add to the dough rather than overmixing it. Here are my chocolate chips. Again, I actually like having a little bit of chocolatey crunch and bite to it when I bite into a brownie, instead of just having one fudgy consistency, but that's really up to personal preference, and you can do whatever you like best. I have also found that aligning my cake pan with parchment paper makes removal of the brownies a whole lot easier. I learned that the hard way, and they just come out simpler. You can also simply grease your baking dish and flour it a little bit to make the removal of the brownies a little bit easier. My husband loves walnuts. He loves any nuts. That's why I often, when I make him something or I know that he'll be enjoying them, I add the nuts for his pleasure while baking them. And when you test for doneness, you want to ever so slightly underbake them, because when you pull them out, they are still going to be baking, and you absolutely want to let them cool down before you remove them from the baking dish, because otherwise they're going to be too gooey and too delicate to actually remove. Here they are. These are the perfect sourdough brownies with a little bit sea salt on top. And of course, I have my Sourdough Simplified book that not only teaches you my entire really unique method, it also has recipes in the back: sourdough Dutch baby and focaccia, pretzels, crackers, sourdough carrot cake. What's not to love about that? Sourdough granola. So if you'd like to check that out, there is the link in the description box for you below. Now, if you're looking for more sweet recipes, I have an entire playlist that I'm leaving in the description box below. Also, if you have any questions or comments, I'd love to hear from you again in the comment section. Thank you so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.